And so skipping breakfast, if you look at the epidemiological data over and over and over, people that skip breakfast live shorter, more cardiovascular disease, deaths, et cetera, et cetera. Then recently, I did a sort of opening article for cell metabolism for three studies, two studies that were not mine, but then there was a third also. They were looking at when you start breakfast, and then metabolism and energy expenditure and all of that. And they showed that they brought people to the clinic and they gave them exactly the same food. They either gave it to them starting at 8 a.m. or they gave it to them starting at 12 p.m., right? And the ones that started at 12 p.m. had a lower energy expenditure eventually and increased hunger, right? Which may begin to explain why the breakfast skippers and these are randomized clinical trials, they're not epidemiological studies. So, but this may start explaining why the epidemiological data is showing these worse associations for people that skip breakfast.
Well, Dr. Valter Longo, thank you so much for making time to join me on the podcast today. For a long time, your areas of interest have been metabolism and longevity. Initially, you started your research in humans and in mice, and then you moved to study yeast. And a lot of people at the time thought you were crazy. Why yeast? Was it because it's such a simple organism to study and it has a rapid life cycle? And what did you find?
Yes, yeast, because at the time in the early 90s, there was not a single gene known to control aging. So really aging was a lot of ideas, right? Everybody had a different opinion. And could you control it? Could you not control it? And so I think that different people, maybe around 10 groups, some went to worms, some went to fruit flies, and a few of us went to yeast. And yeast was the simplest of all of them. And so it's a unicellular organism with only about 6,000 genes. And so it was very easy to manipulate genetically. And so you could just ask the question, which gene can make this simple organism live longer, a lot longer? Eventually, we were able to do 2 mutations, so affect 2 genes and cause a 10-fold lifespan extension by the 2 gene genetic mutation plus fasting, right? So fasting is, even 30 years ago, was at the center of making all kinds of organisms that we study live longer, both bacteria and yeast. And so then we stuck with focus on fasting in addition to the genetics of aging.
And when you say fasting, was this the blocking of the sugar pathway? It's access to sugar.
Well, I mean, so we block the sugar pathway, the RAS, what's called RAS in yeast, and we block the TOR cis-kinase pathway, which is the amino acid, the protein pathway, and then we starve them on top of it, right? So we did all 3. But if you just did block the sugar and the protein pathway, you get about a 5-fold lifespan extension. But if you did that plus the fasting, then you get a 10-fold lifespan extension, right? So interesting. That means that there's still other pathways which haven't been identified that mediate. So fasting goes partially through these 2 pathways, but also partially through other pathways.
And with fasting, you see similar effects in mice, but it's not a linear progression as far as longevity is concerned.
Yes. So in mice, we see lifespan extension, but especially we see health span extension. So the mice live longer, but they're much healthier. We saw a major reduction in inflammatory diseases, in cancer, also improvements in cognitive decline. So they seem to be doing better, both with the normal mice and with the Alzheimer mice. They seem to be healthier longer, or much longer.
I've heard you say that obesity and smoking are major risk factors for disease, but they are way, way overshadowed by aging as a risk factor for disease. So targeting aging as a driver of disease is the really most important thing for you.
Yes, I always, at the beginning of my talks, I always show this slide from the CDC, and basically showing smoking and obesity is the top risk factors for cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer, cancer. And then I show 30 years of aging, right? And they almost disappear as a risk factor. The 30 years of aging is so much bigger as a risk factor that even smoking nearly disappears. Yeah.
And why do you think aging is ignored? It seems to be certainly ignored and overshadowed, as we said there, by smoking and by obesity. Why do you think it doesn't make up a bigger part of that conversation?
I think that traditionally we didn't think we could do anything about aging. And also medical schools, I always say medical schools should start and end with a course on healthy longevity, but they don't. And so I think the training of physicians and most healthcare professional is focused on sick care and wait until somebody's sick, and then lots of interventions on the sick people. And so then aging is not really viewed as relevant, because in that model where somebody has diabetes and then you give this person lots of drugs, or the cancer and you give them immunotherapy, chemotherapy. So why would you worry about aging, right? So that I would say the great majority of the healthcare is focusing on that. Wait until somebody's got a problem and then intervene. And in that case, yes, aging doesn't really matter that much, right? So
in your talks, you often mention the 5 pillars of longevity with respect to humans. Can you just go through those for the listeners now?
Yeah, so I think that the surprise, as I listen to lots of people with podcasts, and some of them, having millions of followers, the surprise is that a lot of them will focus maybe on one pillar, let's say like epidemiological data. And within that pillar, then, the epidemiological data that is most convenient for whatever agenda they might have. Some people may say, well, I love meat, and so I'm just going to pick the papers that support meat. And so I think that's one pillar, right? Epidemiological studies are one pillar. So big population, what happens? People eat a lot of meat, and people that eat a lot of protein versus the people that eat low protein diet. And but that's not enough. It's just one of the 5 pillars, and the other ones are, for example, basic research on aging. So what about a mouse? What if you give a mouse a low protein diet versus a high protein diet? What about a rat? So basic research focus on longevity. Another pillar is clinical studies, randomized clinical studies. So if you take 2 groups and you give one high proteins and one low protein, what happens after 2 weeks, right? So what happens is a lot, right? So you see big differences in IGF-1, lots of other markers. And then another key pillar is centenarians, right? So a lot of people talk about ketogenic diet, and a lot of people talk about low carb diet, but I always say I've never met a centenarian on a low carb diet. So that doesn't mean that a low carb diet could not be very beneficial, but we just don't know, right? So then you sort of have to go with. So I met hundreds of centenarians, and they're all on a high carb diet, and so okay, well, the epidemiological data supports the high carb diet being the best for longevity. And not to be confused with the high sugar or high starch diet, but certainly a high carb diet. And so that's I think the approach that we should take. And then the 5th pillar is complex system, like planes and cars. But usually I talk less about that because it's less validated by science. But I think it's an important pillar. So how does a car age? What's the best way to keep a car running in? I like that because we build the car, and we know each component, and we know what's wrong with each component after you've been driving it 300,000 miles. So I like that. I like this reductionist, or certainly we build that we understand that in each detail. So that makes the aging process in that system, even though it is a machine, but it makes the aging process much easier to, it makes it very clear what it is that made the car stop running, right? So, or made the tires wear out. And so I think I also like that other people are not as enthusiastic about my fifth pillar.
You mentioned protein there a couple of minutes ago. You're not a fan of a low carb, high protein diet. You reckon that's not good for you at all?
Yeah. So again, if we look at all the pillars, mice live longer. They have a low protein diet, but mice don't like to have a low protein diet when they're older, right? And people, our own work, if they have a low protein diet and they move into a moderate protein diet when they get older, they do the best. And then proteins control at least one of the major or several of the major IGF-1. They control TOR signaling. So so I think in general, if you look at all the pillars, and you conclude in not just our epidemiological studies, also lots of work from Harvard, for example, looking at people on a low carb diet, especially if it's not plant-based, they tend to do worse or much worse than people on a high carb diet. So so if you put it all together, including the centenarians, again, never met one that wasn't a low carb diet. You go with the high carb diet, mostly plant-based, low sugar, relatively low starch. That seems to be even the people that are fans of the low carb diet, they will admit that's probably not so bad, right? And that's really what we're trying to achieve. Say, could this be as good as what you think the low carb diet may achieve, right? And so most of them will say yes, but now in my case, when I talk about the longevity diet, and I say it does not have the risk that we already have 50 years of data on this, and so we're really de-risking the recommendations. Whereas in the low carb, in the ketogenic diet domain, there's still a lot of uncertainty with lots of data suggesting they'll make you live shorter and not longer.
Yeah, there seems to be confusion, certainly with people out there who aren't scientists, who are confused between, let's say, the high protein diet, the high carb diet, and then you make the distinction between the high carb diet and the excess carb diet, which is reliant on sugar. Is it the case then that sugar helps to accelerate the aging process? Because there was a relationship there I've heard you talk about before between sugar and cancer and sugar and aging.
Yes, but it's very complicated because one thing is to think about a simple organism where sugar directly connects with the pro-aging genes. And one thing is to think about a human being where sugar is highly regulated. And so you could have lots of sugar, but not necessarily lots of sugar-dependent signaling, right? But you could, but not necessarily, right? So then it's really a matter of insulin and IGF-1 and TOR and lots of the signaling. So what is that sugar? So if you took on lots of sugar, how long, what is the effect of that sugar on insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity, et cetera, et cetera? What is it on the signaling molecules? So it gets pretty complex. But I think in general, and then you have to think about age-specific use and importance. So sugar may actually be very important to an 83-year-old as an infection, right? And somebody's got COVID, and it may be that the difference between life and death could be, do you have enough sugar to support some immune system expansion to fight the virus, right? So I'm speculating here, but this is pretty clear that. And we also saw with proteins, as you get older, a few extra pounds, maybe higher sugar levels, higher protein levels could actually be helpful to you, right? So, and I know it sounds confusing, but that's the way it is, right? So we cannot, like I always say, you cannot lose the keys in the dark and go look for them in the light, right? So I'm sorry, it's in the dark. If you want to find them, you got to look in the dark, right? So figure out how to look into the dark. And unfortunately, people, it's too complicated. I mean, we're now up and down in sugars and carbohydrates and starches. Yeah, well, guess what? Nutrition is one of the most complex fields out there, and people, it's not about carrots. So I think that the future is going to be a progressively more respected field because it's so central to life and health.
And indeed, central to that study is looking at people like the Okinawans and the Calabrians in Sardinia, where you have the highest percentage of centenarians in the world. What does their diet look like that we might be able to emulate in order to live as long as they're living?
Yeah. Well, by the way, I think it's important whether it's Sardinia or Calabria or Okinawa, it's important to point out that a lot of the times it's very specific areas, right? Where there's probably a combination of genetics and lifestyle, right? So they have the right genes, and that's why you see some villages in Sardinia and lots of other places, right? So, but in general, historically at least, the nutrition seem to be the perfect one, especially in their adulthood, right, where they had lots of beans and lots of vegetables. That's all they just ate what they could grow in their backyard. And then so then their diet forced them to be on a low protein, and it forced them to be on a high vegetable, and it forced them to be on a relatively low sugar, because sugar was expensive, right? Even bread was expensive, and taught to centenarians that were in the war, and they would say for years and years and years, even bread was something that we would not get very much of. So so they were forced to eat a low starch, low sugar, high vegetable, high bean diet. And but then eventually, as they moved to their 70s, 80s, and 90s, many of them moved in with their sons and daughters, right? And so we suspected this very poor diet, very restricted diet, followed by a very rich diet later, was in fact this phenomenon in Okinawa, in Sardinia, in lots of places around the world. It led to this longevity record phenomenon because it was like a perfect historical moment to have starvation followed by fairly rich diet when you get very old.
In recent years, there's been a huge increase in interest in fasting, be it intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating or the 5-2 diet. And I know you're a proponent of the fasting mimicking diet, and you believe that is the best. Can you tell us what your thoughts are on fasting, first of all, and then in that context, to give us more details on the fasting mimicking diet?
Yeah, so I was a student of Roy Walford back in the early 90s, and Roy was the sort of leading, the most famous person in the planet for nutrition and aging, right? And he was working on something called calorie restriction. And calorie restriction is just what happens if you eat the same diet that you want to eat, maybe a Western diet, but eat 25% less, right? And but from those days, even though Walford was more pushing for a vegan, so Walford was combining two things. But from those days, I think that, to me, I saw that this is never going to happen, right? So I said people have a hard time if they drink 4 coffees a day, go from 4 coffees a day to 3 coffees a day, right? So revolutionizing the nutrition of a person, especially if it's calorie restriction is never going to work. Even if it did work. So so the fasting mimicking diet is really maybe 20 years of work by my laboratories in both in Italy and in Los Angeles, looking for, can we come up with something that people can actually do? It's not invasive enough to impose a lifestyle change, even though of course you want people to eat better and all that. And so so then the idea was, well, what if we do something that lasts 5 days? And to the body, and the body responds to it as if it was water only fasting. And so all these markers that we talked about, IGF-1 and TOR and insulin and glucose and ketone bodies, they move in the same way that they would move if they were just not eating at all. And so that's a fasting mimicking diet. It's a low carb, a low sugar, high fat, low protein, low calorie, 5 days vegan diet. And so then we started doing lots of trials. Now there's probably over 25, 30 trials that have been done with the fasting mimicking diet for cancer, for diabetes, for healthy people, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea was just that, right? So what if we maybe once a month or once every 4 months, we give a person this FMD, what happens, and and the results, especially for I think diabetes, pre-diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular risk factor. Now there's maybe like 10 trials that have addressed this. It's pretty consistent, right? It's just reducing LDL, is not really affecting HDL, is reducing A1C, it is reducing abdominal fat, it's not touching lean body mass, so the muscle are protected, and is reducing blood pressure. So it's really, even though you do it once, maybe every 1 to 3 months, that's what we've covered so far in clinical trials. They seems to be going after all these things that are evidence of the body becoming more dysfunctional with age. And so I think that we probably got it right, at least for cardiometabolic diseases. We'll see for cancer, but even the cancer part and autoimmunities and cognitive, it's looking promising. But I mean, we're not at the same stage as we are for cardiometabolic.
And these the fasting mimicking diets, are these comprising of whole foods, or do they incorporate supplementation also?
We really view it as a medicine, right? It's a medicine that to the person means a soup, a bar made of certain nuts, certain vegetable. But really, we're trying to make it as feasible for people, as reasonably close to their, to a normal 5 days of, let's say, of a vegan diet as we can, right? But it's very standardized, right? Very standardized, because we want to always get the same ingredients in there. And so, for example, some people complain about, because there are starches in there, and we don't want, purposely, I designed it so that ketone bodies don't get too high and then too low. I don't want people to go to this yo-yo, very high ketone bodies, very low, because I'm worried, right? What will happen after 200 times or 100 times that you do very high ketone bodies, very low, right? So I rather compress it, be much safer, and that's what the fasting mimicking diet is trying to achieve. And the other thing, people complain, but I get a sugar spike after certain soups, but we're saying maybe that sugar spike is helping you protect your muscle. We don't know for sure. We know it's now a number of trials, the muscle are protected, and the A1C drops dramatically, right? So it's working. And so we're having a hard time sometimes explaining to people, you have to keep it standardized, always the same, because, and this was somebody from the FDA, a former director, that told me, it's like, you think you know what's working in your diet, but you don't know, right? You really, this is why the FDA makes you standardize it, because you have an opinion, and what if your opinion is wrong? What if you think this is causing the effect of the fasting mimicking diet, but it happens to be that the worst thing in it, like the starches, are some of the most important factors in dropping A1C and in protecting your muscle, right? So we got to go with the standardization, and that's why it's not whole foods. It's dried soups, but we try to make it as or the company tries to make it as tasty as possible, but trying to make it as standardized as possible.
I have engaged in intermittent fasting on and off for a period of time now. So there are a couple of days a week where I don't have breakfast. I've heard that you're not a fan of not having breakfast. Can you clarify, please?
Yeah, so I go with the data, but I go with also hypothesis-driven data or science, and so skipping breakfast, if you look at the epidemiological data over and over and over, people that skip breakfast live shorter, more cardiovascular disease, deaths, et cetera, et cetera. Then recently I did a sort of opening article for cell metabolism for two studies that were not mine, but then there was a third also. They were looking at when you start breakfast, and then metabolism and energy expenditure and all of that. And they show that they brought people to the clinic and they gave them exactly the same food. They either gave it to them starting at 8 a.m. or they gave it to them starting at 12 p.m., right? And the ones that started at 12 p.m. had a lower energy expenditure eventually and increased hunger, right? Which may begin to explain why the breakfast keepers and these are randomized clinical trials, they're not epidemiological studies. So, but this may start explaining why the epidemiological data is showing this worse associations for people that skip breakfast. They may be more hungry all the time, and they may end up, eating more and also burning less calories.
If people listening to this want to stave off metabolic disease and they also want to live as long as is possible, what should their diets look like in general terms? And then at what point in their life should they consider looking at longevity? I know you've dealt with some teenagers before, and you've given them longevity diets. So can you give us some details on that?
Well, I wrote a book, or I think now translated into English. I wrote it originally in Italian, and it says longevity starts in children. And so we started from the mother, actually. We started from the diet to the mother and showing how important it is, for potentially for the lifespan and the health span of the son or daughter. So yeah, it has to be starting very early. And I think, some of the key factors, I really am a big fan again of a pescatarian diet, so vegan, taking from the 5 pillars, vegan plus fish, maybe 3 or 4 times a week. The fish, low mercury, and trying to get the less polluted fish out there, and then 12 hours time restricted eating, right? So say 9 a.m., 9 p.m. Well, as you go to 16 hours, you get more benefits metabolically short term. But then again, the epidemiological data, a lot of people that do 16 hours, they may skip breakfast. And now we go back into what we just discussed. And then the three times a year fasting mimicking diet, some people may need 2. But if you look at the Europe, we're now over 50% overweight and obese. United States is 72%. So I think most people probably need to do it 3 times a year, or maybe 4 or 5. Now we've finished, I think, 3 or 4 clinical trials on diabetes. Is working very well. University of Heidelberg published one of the first study on fasting mimicking diet and diabetes, and showing some tremendous, and it was nice because they did it against the Mediterranean diet. So there was 5 days a month of Mediterranean diet versus 5 days a month of the fasting mimicking diet. And the Mediterranean diet did absolutely nothing. And the FMD, you see the A1C dropping, you see the insulin resistance dropping, and you see the medication use dropping tremendously. I think that the A1C actually went from 8.1 to 6.7 in a matter of 6 months, 6-monthly cycle. So yeah, look, and now I think with the Leiden trial, it's not published yet, and there's 3 more trials that I have in front of me, but they're not published yet. And so I think I could tell you that those are confirmed. So yeah, then the fasting mimicking diet, and then I think that the exercise, of course, is always important. Maybe 150 minutes a week of exercise, and maybe an addition to an hour a day of walking. Those are my recommendations.
You seem to be a man who has several missions. So one, pushing longevity and fighting metabolic disease, which shortens people's lives, and incorporating longevity as part of standard healthcare, but also fighting against all of the misinformation out there and the confusing information at times.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate, because I think that that's doing lots of damage to lots of people. And I just encourage people to take their time and finding the experts and the podcast, etc., that are respectful of having a variety of opinions, but making sure that there's really a 360 approach in looking at everything. So If you are not trained in longevity and some of the preventive medicine approaches that we're talking about, it may be difficult for some people, even though they may not realize it, right? But there's so many moving parts in nutrition and longevity that if you did not receive the training in that, probably you're gonna get a couple of things right and a couple of things wrong. And so I just hope that again, podcasters and people that listen to them, they tend to demand more, all of it, right? I want it all, right? So I want the expert, but I want also whatever entertainment or whatever else that these some of these shows may provide. And it should be based on multi-pillar. That would be one of the first thing I would check, right? So are the people talking? Are they just keep talking about epidemiology, or they are well-rounded in putting it all together in a multi-pillar fashion? It doesn't have to be my pillar, but it certainly has to be. Yes, I understand. For example, you don't want to ignore centenarians as you're making decisions, like people that already lived 100 years, they did very well, and ignoring that information will be a big mistake.
If people want to find out more about your own work, where can we send them?
Well, two places. One, the longevity diet. I donate 100% of the royalties to charity and the foundations, which is two. So createcures.org, createcures.org is the foundation website. So we have clinics in both Europe and the United States, and so those. Now there's, I don't know, maybe like 20 nutrition experts in the 4 clinics that we have now. We're hoping to reach more places around the world. So if somebody wants to join the network, please contact me, and we're happy to try to set it up.
Well, it's important work and really interesting research, and I wish you all the very best with your endeavors. Dr. Valter Longo, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.